I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. The Museum of the City of New York celebrating its centennial with an innovative exhibit. We'll talk about that later, but first, rent hikes. This week, a New York City panel, the Rent Guidelines Board, had its preliminary vote on rent increases for more than 1 million rent-stabilized apartments. Discussions by the panel on rent hikes have reached as high as 16%. Joining me to discuss what's happening with rents is Mihir Zaveri, Metro reporter for the New York Times, who covers housing in the city. Mihir, when the board reaches this preliminary decision, which it did this week, what's the point of holding hearings when, as you wrote the other day, most of the final decisions are pretty close to what it reaches preliminarily?
Yeah, I mean, there is a system that they use, and it's supposed to be about including public input. And there have been several meetings already. There will be some more meetings before the final vote. At the meeting earlier this week, they did remind people that, hey, we are still listening. Like many government functions, you might be cynical about that because the outcome always does seem predetermined. Like you said, I mean, the preliminary ranges that were approved last week, which is 2 to 5% on one-year leases increases and 4 to 7% on two-year leases, that, almost always the final number falls within those ranges. And that's been the case for years and years at this point.
And you wrote that these are some of the biggest increases in years as they were last year.
Yeah.
Last time.
That's right. I mean, and this is essentially more or less the ranges that were preliminary ranges proposed this year were the same as the preliminary ranges proposed last year. And those last year were the largest since 2013. So part of this is a difference in philosophy, perhaps, between the board under Mayor Bill de Blasio and the Mayor Eric Adams, where the current mayor has been more sympathetic to the challenges facing landlords, perhaps. But you also have other factors going on, like the inflation is much higher now. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of other things that go into it.
How do the statisticians for the board come up with these numbers? How do they figure out how much is too much for tenants and how much is enough for landlords?
I mean, that is the million, well, I probably shouldn't say $1 million, right, but the $1 million question. And it's, it's somewhat of a black box in that people, the layperson, will have really no idea, but they weigh a bunch of different factors. So, they'll look at things affecting tenants. How many people are rent burdened? What is the median rent? How many people are employed? What are wages looking like? They'll look at things that affect landlords. Are insurance costs going up? Are real estate taxes going up? Is the cost of labor going up? Are there more distressed buildings now than there were before? All of that comes together to, spit out a final number that they think is appropriate. And one of the factors, and one of the more contentious factors, is whether the net operating income of rent-stabilized buildings should be held steady or not. That's commonly a gauge of building health, net operating income, and that has been a big factor in the past and in many boards.
What percent profit does the Rent Guidelines Board assume that landlords ought to make?
So the thing is, they don't really look at profit. So the net operating income doesn't take into account debt service, so what your mortgage payments might be. It doesn't take into account what you might be taxed on the profit. It doesn't take into account the change in value, for example, of these buildings. So really, they're looking only at this net operating income as a measure of building health, which is, again, it is rent income subtracted by costs like insurance, fuel, things like that. But there are other factors, and so if you ask tenant groups, that is a huge question, right? How much profit are they making? And that is also why this particular vote and this particular sphere is such a representation of our broader housing conversations. How much profit should landlords make, right?
How much profit should anybody make?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And what about tenants? Does anyone take into account what these increases would do to the proportion of income that tenants pay in rent? I mean, the theory is that tenants should not be paying more than about 30% of their income on rent. We know that in the city, somewhere between a third and half of the tenants are paying more than that.
Right. I mean, if you ask the board, they'll say they absolutely do because they look at those overall statistics. But at the same time, there are these very specific calculations for landlord net operating income that there isn't really a comparable metric for tenants. They don't look specifically at, how tenants are doing in this very specific way that you mentioned. And that is a point of contention that some of the tenant representatives on the board have brought up. They've said, why are we doing this for landlords if we're not doing it for tenants?
Mm-hmm. Who makes this decision? Who's on the rent guidelines board? How do they get there?
So 9 members. They are all appointed by the mayor. There are 2 representatives that are supposed to represent the property owners. There are 2 representatives supposed to represent tenants. And then there's 5 that just represent the general public. The fact that they're appointed by the mayor is sort of widely seen as a fact that, in essence, like this board reflects a lot of what the mayor wants.
And are the people on the board now left over from de Blasio, or are they new Eric Adams appointees?
At this point, they are now mostly new Eric Adams appointees. The first vote last year, I think he had about 3 out of this.
So as you said, the mayor really influences who gets what.
Right, and the chair now is a Mayor Eric Adams appointee. So then the chair is often the arbiter between the tenants and the owners, and kind of comes to the middle ground decision that they arrive at.
I don't envy that position.
Right.
Mayor, you said that about 2,044% of the rental apartments in the city are rent stabilized. What about the rest? Are they? How do rent control figure into it, and also market rate apartments?
Yeah, so it's about 1 million apartments which are rent stabilized, 2 million tenants living in them. Those represent about 40%, like you said, of all rentals. Rentals make up 2/3 of the city's housing stock, roughly, right? So we have much more of a city of renters than the overall country. The other proportions, by far the largest component of rentals is market rate, unregulated. Well, I shouldn't say market rate, they're just unregulated. Some landlords definitely are renting it below market rates, some are renting it above market rates. So it's about 50% unregulated. Then there's of course, NYCHA, public housing, which is what we talked about once before, right? The 300,000, 400,000 people, so it's about 100,000 or 200,000 units, I think. And then there's a very, very, very small proportion of rent-controlled units. It's like 16,000 or something like that, some very, very small amount.
And how do the rent stabilization rent increases compare to increases in the private market?
Yeah, that's a great question. The problem right now is the pandemic has just really thrown everything into disarray, right? We saw rents drop significantly in 2020. We saw that now we're seeing them rebound sharply, and now they're sort of tapering off again ahead of the expected summer surge. But at the same time, so the whole point of rent stabilization is to insulate people from these sort of sharp increases and things like that. So like you say, last year, 3 to 6%, 3% on 1-year leases, 6% on 2-year leases, what they ultimately arrived at. You're seeing double-digit increases in rents over the same period over market rate units, particularly in high attractive neighborhoods like, Central Brooklyn, Manhattan, places where people really left and now are coming back.
Are there rent stabilization or similar programs in other cities? A lot of people complain that this is really a drag on affordable housing, on new housing in the city. Why should a landlord or a developer build new housing when he knows that he's going to have a clamp on the rents he can impose?
Yeah, there are a lot of other places that have similar systems, California, New Jersey, places around the world. To the point about whether it's dampens the ability to build more, that is the biggest contention that a lot of, especially economists, will make, is like rent control is not really, it warps the market and it makes disincentive. Of course, if you're dealing with rent increases, you may have a different opinion, of course. But at the same time, let's take tax breaks, for example. That has been one of the ways that we've built big apartment buildings and affordable housing in particular in New York City. And we can quibble about what's affordable and what's not, but
a very relative term.
A very relative term. And a lot of people have problems with that as well. But a lot of the apartments and affordable apartments that have been built in New York City are built under this tax break program, 421A, which is very controversial. At the same time, a lot of those units are now rent stabilized. That's part of the deal. Sometimes you get this tax break, you get a stabilized unit. So how it could influence the market, how it could influence new supply. It's a much more complicated question than I think some economists will say, or even some politicians will say.
So in fact, the number of rent stabilized apartments is not finite. You can keep adding to it if you're building with tax breaks or things like that.
Exactly.
Let me ask you about public housing in the city, the housing authority. Are things getting any better? We've had Mayor Adams here for over a year. Have things changed at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a complicated question with public housing. In some ways, I would say there are people who think it's getting better in that there are people who believe the strategies they're employing right now, transferring some over to private management, transferring some over to this new public benefit corporation, that is a light at the end of the tunnel in some ways. Like that will provide the type of money that's needed to repair and rehab. At the same time, that's a difficult prospect politically, and also for residents living in these places, things are getting worse day to day. One example I'll give you is the Chelsea Fulton houses in Manhattan. There had been a push to demolish these buildings because they were in such bad condition some years ago. Residents really didn't like that because it's a really scary proposition that maybe you'll lose your public housing. Mm-hmm. So they decided they wanted to repair it. Turns out, in the process of wanting to repair and rehab, the problems are actually so much worse than they initially thought. It makes no sense to spend all that money. So now they're thinking about actually demolishing them again. So it's just, I give that example of like, we think the problems are at a certain level, and I think they may actually be much bigger.
And the federal government, which used to be such a font of money for public housing, we now have a Democratic administration. Has that made a difference?
It hasn't. There was a big push in the last infrastructure bill to include lots of money for public housing. Ultimately, it fell out. I mean, it was very criticized by Republicans. It was held up as a sort of NYCHA is always held up as the symbol of, disorder and mismanagement, and so no, essentially.
Thanks to Metro reporter of the New York Times, Mihir Zaveri. And coming up next, the Museum of the City of New York celebrates turning 100 with a unique exhibition. The Museum of the City of New York is celebrating the centennial of its founding with an exhibition called This is New York, 100 Years of the City in Art and Pop Culture. That explores the city's storytelling in film and television, song and poetry, literature. Joining us is Jane Levere, a freelance writer with the New York Times, and Sarah M. Henry, the interim director and chief curator of the Museum of the City of New York. Jane, in working on this article for the Times, what did you discover new about New York City? We all seem to think we know everything about New York, but I learn something new every day.
Exactly. I think one of the things that struck me was the diversity of all of the arts that are displayed in the exhibit. I mean, I knew that there were paintings done about the city and that there were songs written about the city, but the depth of all of these things that the exhibit gets into is mind-boggling, truly.
And Sarah, what is it you want people to leave with after seeing this exhibit? We've seen so many exhibits, obviously, your museum, elsewhere, books about New York City. When they leave this exhibit, which opened May 26th and runs through next June, what do you want people to feel, to think?
We want people to think about all these New Yorks of the mind. And we deal with with the real New York, or what we think of as the real New York every day. At the Museum of the City of New York, we tell that history. But equally important, I think, are the New Yorks that we carry around in our heads. And for people to realize how important those images that are created and really reach people all over the world who will never come to New York City. There are literally billions of people around the world who feel like they have a stake in New York City, that they have a New York that they believe in and that they imagine, who have never set foot here and may never set foot here. But to take this idea of image making and storytelling really seriously and understand that those New Yorks of the mind actually have an independent power and importance. Mm-hmm. And also to get them to think about, well, where do their images of New York come from? What are the sources that have consciously or unconsciously shaped the city that they carry around in their head? And actually to argue about it. The title is This is New York, and that's like a pretty bold statement. We're really challenging people to say, do you think this is New York, or is there a different New York?
Well,
That's yours.
That's my question.
Yeah.
Is it New York? Does it live up to these images for better or for worse?
Sure. Well, one of the things we explore is the ways in which human stories are told. So it's very much about subjectivity. So living up to these images, it all depends upon who you are, where you walk, what neighborhoods you circulate in, and what you notice. And one of the themes that emerges in the show is that, as we know, New York, no one's neutral about it, right? We love New York. We also hate New York.
We love to hate it.
We
too.
love to hate it. We hate that we love it. And the conflicting emotions, that kind of simultaneously, like cognitive dissonance that the arts create is also what we experience every day in New York. So I feel like there's a huge dialogue between these artistic and creative representations and our own subjective experience every day.
Jane, tell us about some of the specific exhibits and the ones that you found most interesting. There's Songs of the City, You Are Here. What are the things that, if you had a choice of 2 or 3, you would go to first?
Well, I think for me personally, the coolest parts of the exhibit is the song section of the exhibit. There is a diagram on the floor of that part of the gallery of each borough. And when you step on the borough whose music you want to hear, a song is played that's based on the borough. So, for example, Jenny from the Block, Jennifer Lopez's song about the Bronx is you hear it in the gallery when you step on the picture of the Bronx.
Now, I remember in This Land Is Your Land, the original version said not Manhattan, the Manhattan Island, but Staten Island, and he crossed that out. So is there really a Staten Island song?
Oh, there are more Staten Island songs than you can imagine.
Okay.
And it was really fun researching that, finding the range of them, and the fact that Staten and Manhattan rhyme actually does help, but it goes back to I'm a Latin from Staten, but comes all the way up to the present. So we hit all of the boroughs, and also it's 100 years. So the museum's turning 100 this year, the oldest city museum in the United States. And in honor of that anniversary, we're looking at creations, songs, movies, paintings, literature, poetry, from 1923 to 2023. So that's the range. So not only borough range and diversity of the population, but also this changing century.
Jane, what about You Are Here? What does that exhibit show? The You Are Here exhibit?
The film immersive.
Yes,
film.
yes. That's actually, I think, my favorite part of the exhibit. There are snippets of over 400 films that are going to be shown in this special gallery. How would you describe what the film?
Yeah, you're surrounded.
going to be.
It's an immersive room, so you're surrounded on 3 sides by screens. 16 of them. It was created by Radical Media, who did Summer of Soul recently. And on these 16 screens, you get a story played out that's made up of the clips of hundreds of films made since 1923.
How neat.
Yeah, so it's a real ode to New York on film, like the city on celluloid. And there's actually an introduction to it, speaking of celluloid city, James Sanders.
James Sanders, great.
Who not only wrote Celluloid Skyline, but also Scenes from the City,
right.
and the Rick Burns,
Rick Burns, New York.
documentary. But his Scenes from the City is about how films get made in New York, and there's an introductory gallery that shows some of that behind the scenes, the making of the myths around the city. But the You Are Here, it's a 21-minute film, and it is a ride, let me tell you, because you've got films that you recognize instantly, like very famous lines. You can probably think of some of them off the top of your head, but also really going into all the boroughs, really looking at independent film, documentary film. It's really fun.
How do you avoid being Manhattan-centric in an exhibition like this? How do you make sure that it is diverse, at least covering the other boroughs, Jane?
Well, I think Sarah could address that probably better than I, because I didn't put the exhibit together. I just wrote about it. But it definitely appears to me, both from my research and running into the museum yesterday, that all of the boroughs are covered.
Yeah.
All 5 of them, definitely.
Yeah, and when we think about the New Yorks of the imagination, I think you can't argue that a couple of boroughs play a bigger than life role
No,
in
that's
our popular
just a given.
imagination. Manhattan has long been a center of fascination. I think a lot of people would argue that the cultural salience of Brooklyn globally
Yes.
has grown enormously
Exactly.
over the last generation.
And was always outsized,
Yeah.
if I may say, as a Brooklynite.
If I'm
But
not mistaken, it was a separate city.
it was, yeah.
Originally.
Sure.
But every borough has its mystique. And I think that they all have name recognition and a cultural salience of their own. But we really did work to get into the eyes and ears of artists from all of the boroughs. And the most recent work in the show that you featured in your article
Yes.
by Shen Julian, who's a
Painting.
Bronx-born artist, and it's a painting made this year, Salsa Sundays at Orchard Beach. And thinking about what that beach, the only beach in the Bronx, and the only borough on the mainland, what Orchard Beach means to the community there, and portrayed through this just joyous depiction of dancing. And I think you were really attracted to that picture as
Absolutely.
well.
Very colorful and joyous.
Sarah, I'm often reminded of the plan for New York City in 1969, and it ended by saying, we are in some optimistic, but we are also New Yorkers, as if these are two mutually exclusive things. We cannot see utopia, even if all these recommendations were carried out, if all the money were somehow raised. 10 years from now, all sorts of new problems will have arisen, and New Yorkers will be talking of the crisis of the city, what a near hopeless place it is, and why doesn't somebody do something? So have things really changed in the city over 100 years?
I think that feeling, that inner conflict about celebrating the city, kind of rejoicing in everything that it represents, refusing to give up on it, and at the same time having a kind of rueful embrace of the strife and struggles, deep problems, that has been a theme that you see from, I would say, almost as long as New York has been around, and definitely comes through in the art of the 1923 to 2023. It's an embrace, it's a celebration, but it's a critique, it's a clear-eyed look, and it's from very many different points of view, which I think people from all over the century and all over the city share that kind of dual thinking, that conflicted thinking about New York.
And we've been through many crises over the 400-year history of New York, and we have shown periodically a resilience. Do you think that resilience is still there? We talk about the crisis of the city now, vacant office space, all sorts of other things that we're facing challenges about. Are we still resilient as a city, or has our time passed?
Well, one of the things about being a historian and working in a museum, and for example, in New York at its core, which is our permanent galleries, there's an entire gallery dedicated to the 20th century, and it is a story of one crisis and one existential crisis after another, which is one moment after another when people say the best days of New York are behind us. In fact, we don't even really need a city anymore. The idea of the city has been bypassed. And in each case, we've been reinvented, and I think we're seeing that reinvention going on around us as we speak.
I think that's true. Thanks to both of you, Sarah Henry of the Museum of the City of New York, Jane Levere, writing for the New York Times, and coming up next, my thoughts on if you're thinking of moving to Florida. Is Florida eating New York's lunch? Open debate, which used to be called Intelligence Squared, pitted former Mayor Bill de Blasio against Rian Salam, president of the conservative Manhattan Institute for Policy Research last week, in a colloquy over whether the Sunshine State is thriving in part at New York's expense. On cue, de Blasio defended the city. He talked up New Yorkers' brio, the city's diversity, the safety from extremism, and tolerance. Salam started off by saying, quote, "Like all sane people, I would much prefer a slice of cheesecake to a slice of key lime pie. So much for eating New York's lunch." Predictably, he went on to mention a shrinking ladder of opportunity. the loss of jobs in retail, leisure, hospitality, where working-class immigrants had gained a foothold. But surprisingly, he added, quote, "The truth is that really high taxes aren't what's driving out households from the state. There are a lot of people who would be willing to pay more. The problem is that we have high taxes and quite low quality services." De Blasio countered by praising the police, fire departments, and health services. But Salam, the son of immigrants from Bangladesh, said the problem is that New York is creating conditions that are tolerable for the ultra-rich, but intolerable for lower-income residents. The city is doing a pretty good job of retaining rich people, he said, but it's driving out strivers, working, and middle-class people who've been taken for granted. Salam sounded a warning. The day of reckoning is coming, he said, unless city officials contain noise, congestion, and crime. De Blasio, bumptiously optimistic, concluded with a historical truth. "It's so interesting how people love to bet against New York City," he said. "They always lose." For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.